bear cub was stuck on a roof. During a meteor shower, what this baby did was shocking. Let us know where you're watching from. If you love my content, consider supporting it with a super thanks. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe. It'll help us to remain in touch with amazing people like you. The night sky had never looked more alive. Streaks of silver and gold painted lines across the darkness as meteors danced overhead. In the small cabin at the edge of Pine Valley, 9-month-old Ruby sat propped against her mother's chest, her tiny hands reaching toward the window as if she could catch the falling stars. "Look at those meteors, sweet girl," whispered Sage, Ruby's mother, gently bouncing the baby on her lap. Ruby's father, Finn, stood at the window with his arms crossed, watching the celestial show with wonder. The meteor shower was supposed to peak tonight, and they had stayed up late just to witness it together as a family. Ruby giggled and clapped her small hands every time a particularly bright meteor streaked past. Her eyes, wide and curious, followed each trail of light with the kind of fascination only babies possess. The room was warm and cozy, filled with the soft glow of a single lamp and the occasional flash of meteor light. But outside, something else was happening. A small brown bear cub, no bigger than a medium-sized dog, had wandered away from its mother's den. The meteors had caught its attention, too, and in its curiosity it had climbed onto the roof of the neighboring house, chasing what looked like a shiny piece of metal that had fallen there earlier. The cub's tiny paws scrambled against the steep shingles as it tried to grab the object, but the roof was slick with evening dew, and suddenly the cub found itself sliding. Its claws scraped against the shingles, sending a few tumbling to the ground with small crashes. Ruby turned her head toward the sound. Her mother and father were too focused on the meteor shower to notice the faint scraping noises coming from next door. But Ruby heard it. She heard the small, frightened whimpers that followed. The cub was now stranded on the edge of the roof, too scared to move forward or backward. Every time it tried to shift its weight, more shingles would loosen, and it would slide a little closer to the edge. The drop wasn't enormous, but for a small cub, it might as well have been a cliff. Ruby pressed her tiny hands against the window glass and let out a soft coo. Something in her baby instincts told her that the sounds outside weren't right. She wasn't old enough to understand what was happening, but she felt it in the way that babies sometimes do. The meteors continued their dance above, unaware of the small drama unfolding below. Each flash of light revealed the cub's precarious position on the neighboring roof, clinging desperately to the shingles as it whimpered for its mother. In the distance, a much larger shape moved through the trees. The mother bear had noticed her cub was missing and was searching frantically, her massive form moving with surprising grace through the forest. She could smell her baby's scent but couldn't pinpoint exactly where it was. Ruby's tiny finger tapped against the window, and she made a sound that was almost like calling out. Her parents smiled, thinking she was excited about the meteors, but Ruby's attention was entirely focused on something else. The cub's cries grew a little louder, carried on the cool night breeze. It was a sound that would break any mother's heart, human or bear. The little creature was truly stuck, and with each passing moment, its grip on the roof grew more uncertain. Ruby suddenly pushed against her mother's chest and pointed toward the window. "Ba, ba, ba," she babbled, her voice carrying an unusual urgency that made Sage look down at her daughter with curious eyes. "What is it, little one?" Sage asked, following Ruby's pointed finger toward the window. But all she could see was the continuing meteor shower and the dark outline of their neighbor's house. The cub let out another whimper, and this time Ruby responded with a louder babble, as if she was trying to answer back. Her small body wiggled in her mother's arms, and she reached both hands toward the window with determination. Finn finally noticed his daughter's behavior. "She seems really worked up about something," he said, moving closer to the window to get a better look outside. The meteors were beautiful, but Ruby seemed to be looking at something specific. That's when they heard it. A faint but distinct sound that cut through the night air. It was the sound of an animal in distress, and it was coming from very close by. Ruby's response was immediate. She let out a cry of her own, not of fear or discomfort, but something that sounded almost like she was trying to communicate. Her parents exchanged glances, suddenly realizing that their baby might be reacting to something they couldn't see or hear as clearly as she could. The night was about to become far more eventful than any of them had expected. Finn grabbed a flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped outside onto their small porch. The cool night air hit his face immediately, carrying with it the earthy scent of pine trees and something else he couldn't quite identify. He pointed the beam of light toward their neighbor's house, scanning the roof line carefully. "I don't see anything," he called back to Sage, who was still holding Ruby by the window. But Ruby continued to babble and point, her little voice growing more insistent with each passing second. The flashlight beam swept across the roof once more, and that's when Finn saw it. Two small reflective eyes caught the light, and below them, a tiny dark shape clung to the edge of the roof. His heart skipped a beat when he realized what he was looking at. "Sage, there's a bear cub on the Hendersons' roof," he said, his voice tight with concern. "It looks like it's stuck." Sage's eyes widened as she looked down at Ruby, who had somehow sensed the cub's distress before either of her parents. How did she know? She whispered, more to herself than to Finn. The cub's whimpers grew more desperate as it sensed the human presence below. Its small paws scrambled against the shingles, sending more of them clattering to the ground. Each sound made Ruby cry out in response, as if she was trying to offer comfort across the distance between them. Finn's mind raced through the possibilities. The Hendersons were visiting their daughter in the city for the weekend, so their house was empty. But calling for help might take too long, and the cub looked like it might not be able to hold on much longer. "We should call the wildlife rescue," Sage suggested. But even as she said it, she knew it would take them at least an hour to get here, maybe more on a night like this, when they were probably dealing with other meteor-related incidents. Ruby suddenly let out a loud, sharp cry that cut through the night air. The sound was unlike anything her parents had heard from her before. It wasn't a cry of distress or hunger, but something more purposeful, more deliberate. And then something remarkable happened. The cub stopped its frantic movement and looked directly toward their cabin. Its small ears perked up, and it tilted its head as if it was listening. For a moment, the night was completely still except for the whoosh of meteors overhead. Ruby made the sound again, softer this time, and the cub responded with a small chirp. It was as if the two babies were having a conversation across species, across the gap between roof and window. "I've never seen anything like this," Sage breathed, watching her daughter with amazement. Ruby seemed completely focused on the cub, her tiny hands pressed against the window glass as she continued to make soft cooing sounds. But their moment of wonder was interrupted by a much louder sound. From somewhere in the forest came a deep, anxious growl. The mother bear had found the trail leading to the house, and she was getting closer. Finn felt his blood run cold. A bear cub in distress was one thing, but a full-grown mother bear looking for her baby was something else entirely. He knew that mama bears would do anything to protect their young, and she would see any human as a potential threat. "We need to go inside," he said quietly to Sage, but she was reluctant to leave the window. Ruby had become even more animated, babbling and reaching toward the roof as if she could somehow help the stranded cub from where she sat. The mother bear's calls grew louder and closer. She was circling the house now, trying to locate her baby's scent trail. Her massive shadow could be seen moving between the trees, and occasionally Her eyes would reflect the meteor light as she searched. The cub heard its mother's calls and began to whimper more urgently. It tried again to move, but its paws slipped on the dew-covered shingles, and it slid another few inches toward the edge of the roof. Ruby's response was immediate and surprising. She began to cry, but not the typical cry of a baby. Instead, she made a rhythmic, almost song-like sound that seemed to calm the cub. Each time Ruby made the sound, the cub would stop struggling and listen. "It's like she's trying to keep it calm," Sage whispered in amazement. Finn had moved to the other window to keep an eye on the mother bear's movements. She was getting agitated, pacing back and forth below the roof where her cub was trapped. Her size was intimidating, but there was something heartbreaking about watching her look up at her baby, knowing she couldn't reach it. "The meteor shower is supposed to continue for another hour," Finn said, thinking out loud. "But I don't think that cub can hold on that long." As if to emphasize his point, another small shingle came loose and tumbled to the ground with a crash. The cub let out a frightened yelp, and Ruby immediately responded with her calming sounds. The mother bear heard her cub's cry and reared up on her hind legs, trying to get closer to the roof. She was enormous, easily 8 feet tall when standing, but even at her full height, she couldn't reach her baby. Ruby suddenly pushed against her mother's arms and pointed toward the door. She babbled something that sounded almost like words, though neither parent could understand what she was trying to say. "She wants to go outside," Sage realized, looking down at her daughter with wonder and concern. "Absolutely not," Finn said immediately. "There's a mama bear out there, and she's already stressed about her cub. She wouldn't hesitate to attack if she thought we were a threat." But Ruby was insistent. She continued to point toward the door, her voice taking on an urgency that made both parents uncomfortable. It was as if she knew something they didn't, as if she had a plan they couldn't understand. The meteors continued to streak across the sky, each flash illuminating the scene below like a cosmic spotlight. The mother bear, the trapped cub, the worried parents, and the baby who seemed to be the only one who understood what needed to happen. Another shingle fell, this one larger than the others. The cub's position was becoming more precarious by the minute, and time was running out. Ruby looked up at her parents with eyes that seemed far too wise for her 9 months of life. She reached toward the door one more time, and this time her babbling sounded almost like pleading. Something was about to happen that would change everything, and somehow this tiny baby seemed to be the key to saving a life. The next few minutes felt like hours to Sage and Finn. They watched helplessly as the cub's situation grew more desperate with each passing moment. The mother bear had begun making low, mournful sounds that tugged at their hearts. Even though she was a wild animal and potentially dangerous, they could see the pain of a mother watching her child in distress. Ruby had become surprisingly quiet, but her eyes never left the window. She seemed to be studying the scene outside with an intensity that made her parents wonder what was going through her little mind. Every few seconds, she would make soft sounds toward the cub, and each time the small bear would respond by looking in their direction. "I think we need to call someone," Sage said finally, though her voice lacked conviction. She knew that by the time help arrived, it might be too late. Finn was about to agree when something unexpected happened. Ruby suddenly straightened up in her mother's arms and pointed not toward the door, but toward the kitchen. She babbled urgently, her small finger jabbing in the direction of the refrigerator. "What is it, sweetie?" Sage asked, following her daughter's pointing finger. "What do you want?" Ruby's babbling became more insistent. She pushed against her mother's chest, clearly wanting to be moved toward the kitchen. Confused but curious, Sage carried her daughter in that direction. As soon as they reached the kitchen, Ruby pointed at a specific cabinet. The one where they kept her baby food and snacks. Sage opened it, and Ruby immediately reached for a small container of applesauce. "You're hungry?" "Now?" Sage asked, but Ruby shook her head and pointed back toward the window. Finn, who had been watching this exchange, suddenly understood. "She wants to give it to the cub," he said with amazement. "She thinks the cub is hungry." Ruby clapped her hands excitedly when she heard her father's words, confirming his guess. She clutched the container of applesauce to her chest and pointed toward the door again. "But honey, that's people food," Sage explained gently. "Bears don't eat applesauce." Ruby's face scrunched up as if she was thinking very hard about something. Then she pointed to a different cabinet, the one where they kept their few camping supplies. Finn opened it and found himself looking at a jar of honey they had bought for their last camping trip. "Honey," he said slowly. "Bears do love honey." Ruby squealed with delight and reached for the jar. It was too heavy for her to hold properly, but she wrapped her small arms around it as best she could. Outside, the cub let out another whimper, and this time it was followed by the sound of more shingles falling. The situation was getting critical. The mother bear's pacing had become more frantic, and she was beginning to make longer, more urgent calls. Ruby looked at her parents with an expression that seemed to say, "Please trust me." It was incredible how much emotion and determination could be packed into a 9-month-old's face. Finn and Sage exchanged glances. What their daughter was suggesting seemed impossible and potentially dangerous, but watching the cub struggle and hearing the mother bear's distress calls, they began to wonder if Ruby somehow understood something they didn't. "Maybe," Finn said slowly, "maybe we could just open the door and let Ruby put the honey outside. The mother bear might smell it and realize we're trying to help." Sage looked uncertain. "But what if the mother bear thinks we're trying to lure her cub away? What if she attacks?" Before either parent could decide, Ruby made the decision for them. She had somehow managed to shift her weight in her mother's arms and was now leaning toward the door handle. Her small hand brushed against it, and to everyone's surprise the latch clicked. The door swung open slightly, letting in the cool night air and the sounds of the forest. Immediately, they could hear the mother bear more clearly. She was circling the house, her heavy footsteps crunching on fallen leaves. Ruby made a soft cooing sound toward the open door, and incredibly the mother bear's pacing slowed. It was as if she had heard the baby and was trying to understand what the sound meant. "Close the door," Sage whispered urgently, but Ruby was already reaching toward the outside with the jar of honey in her arms. The cub on the roof heard Ruby's voice and responded with a small chirp. This seemed to get the mother bear's attention. She stopped pacing and looked up at the roof, then toward the open door where the sounds were coming from. For a moment, the forest was completely silent, except for the distant whoosh of meteors overhead. The mother bear, the trapped cub, and the human family all seemed to be holding their breath. Then Ruby did something that surprised everyone. She began to sing. It wasn't really singing in the traditional sense, but it was a melodic, rhythmic babbling that had a soothing quality to it. She held the honey jar in her lap and sang to the cub on the roof, to the mother bear in the yard, and somehow her voice seemed to calm them both. The mother bear took a step closer to the house. Then another. She was moving slowly, cautiously, but she was definitely approaching the open door. Finn's heart was pounding so hard he was sure everyone could hear it. A massive bear was walking toward their open door, and his baby daughter was sitting there singing to it as if this was the most natural thing in the world. The mother bear stopped about 10 feet from the door and sat back on her haunches. She tilted her massive head and seemed to be listening to Ruby's song. Her ears were forward, alert but not aggressive. Ruby continued her melodic babbling, and amazingly, the cub on the roof seemed to be responding. Its whimpers had stopped, and it was looking down at the scene below with what almost looked like curiosity rather than fear. "I can't believe this is happening," Sage whispered, watching her daughter interact with wild bears as if they were old friends. The mother bear made a soft sound, almost like a question. Ruby responded with a particularly musical babble, and then did something that made both parents gasp. She held up the jar of honey and pointed toward the roof where her cub was stranded. The mother bear followed Ruby's pointing finger with her eyes. She looked at the roof, then back at the baby, then at the honey jar. It was as if she was beginning to understand that these humans weren't a threat to her cub, but perhaps trying to help. Ruby made another sound, this one more urgent, and pointed again at the roof. The mother bear stood up and walked closer to the house. She was now only a few feet from the open door, close enough that they could see the intelligence in her dark eyes. Finn slowly reached for the honey jar in Ruby's lap. He was terrified, but his daughter's fearless behavior was somehow giving him courage. If a 9-month-old baby could face a mama bear, then maybe he could too. Very carefully, he took the jar from Ruby and held it up so the mother bear could see it. She sniffed the air and her nose twitched. Bears had an incredible sense of smell, and she definitely recognized the scent of honey. Ruby clapped her hands and pointed at the roof again, as if explaining to the mother bear what they needed to do. The cub, seeing its mother so close to the house, began to make excited chirping sounds. And that's when the most extraordinary thing happened. The mother bear looked at Ruby, then at Finn holding the honey, then back up at her cub on the roof. She seemed to be thinking, processing what she was seeing and hearing. Then she did something that defied everything they thought they knew about wild animals. She nodded. It was a small movement, barely noticeable, but it was definitely a nod, as if she was agreeing to work together with these strange humans to save her baby. Ruby squealed with delight and clapped her hands. She looked at her parents with an expression of pure joy, as if this was exactly what she had hoped would happen. But the cub was still trapped on the roof, and time was running out. The next part of whatever plan Ruby had in mind was about to unfold, and none of them knew what to expect. The mother bear turned away from the door and walked back toward the house where her cub was trapped. She circled the building slowly, as if she was examining it for the first time. Her massive paws left deep impressions in the soft earth as she moved, and occasionally she would stop and sniff the air or look up at the roof. Ruby watched this with intense fascination, still making soft cooing sounds as if she was encouraging the mother bear. Finn continued to hold the honey jar, though his hands were shaking slightly from the adrenaline of the situation. The cub on the roof had grown quiet, but they could see it moving slightly, trying to find a better grip on the slippery shingles. A few more meteors streaked across the sky, their light revealing just how precarious the little bear's position had become. Suddenly, the mother bear did something unexpected. She reared up on her hind legs and placed her massive front paws against the side of the house. The entire structure seemed to shake slightly under her weight. "What is she doing?" Sage whispered, her voice tight with concern. The mother bear began to make a series of grunting sounds, as if she was talking to her cub. The little bear responded with excited chirps, and for a moment, it seemed like they might be developing their own rescue plan. But then disaster struck. A particularly bright meteor flashed overhead, and in that moment of bright light, the cub got startled and tried to move toward the edge where its mother was standing. Its paws slipped completely on the wet shingles, and with a terrified yelp, it began to slide rapidly toward the edge of the roof. Ruby's response was immediate and shocking. She let out a loud, sharp cry that cut through the night air like a warning signal. But more than that, she began to struggle in her mother's arms, reaching desperately toward the sliding cub as if she could somehow catch it from across the yard. The mother bear heard Ruby's cry and immediately understood the urgency. She dropped down from the house and positioned herself directly below where her cub was sliding. Her massive body tensed, ready to catch her baby if it fell. But the cub managed to catch itself on a piece of loose guttering just before going over the edge. It hung there, suspended 20 feet above the ground, its small paws wrapped around the metal gutter that creaked ominously under even its small weight. Now, the situation was even more desperate than before. The cub couldn't climb back up onto the roof, and the gutter looked like it might not hold for very long. Ruby had become extremely agitated, babbling urgently and pointing at different things around the yard. First, she pointed at the ladder that was leaning against the side of their own house. Then, at the rope that Finn used to hang up their camping gear. Then, at the honey jar he was still holding. "I think she's trying to tell us something," Sage said, studying her daughter's gestures carefully. Finn followed Ruby's pointing finger to the ladder. It was an old aluminum extension ladder that he used for cleaning gutters and minor repairs. "You think she wants us to use the ladder?" he asked. Ruby clapped her hands excitedly and nodded, which was remarkable considering she had only recently learned how to do that. But there was a problem. The ladder would have to be positioned right where the mother bear was standing, and there was no way she would move away from her threatened cub. As if reading his thoughts, Ruby pointed at the honey jar again, then at the ground near the mother bear, then back at the ladder. "She wants me to give the honey to the mother bear," Finn realized. "To show her we're trying to help." Sage looked at her husband with concern. "You're going to walk right up to a stressed mama bear and offer her honey? That's insane." But Ruby was nodding vigorously and making encouraging sounds. She seemed completely confident that this was the right thing to do. Meanwhile, the cub's situation was getting worse. The gutter was starting to bend under its weight, and they could hear the metal creaking with each small movement the little bear made. Finn made a decision that surprised even himself. He stepped outside onto the porch, still holding the honey jar. The mother bear immediately noticed him and turned to face him, but she didn't move away from her position under the cub. "Easy, girl," Finn said softly, the way he might talk to a nervous dog. "We're here to help." Ruby continued making her soothing sounds from the doorway, and incredibly, the mother bear's ears perked up as if she was listening to the baby's voice. Finn took a slow step forward, holding the honey jar out so the bear could see it clearly. The mother bear sniffed the air and made a low rumbling sound that didn't seem aggressive, just cautious. "That's right," Finn continued, taking another careful step. "This is for you and your baby. We want to help." The mother bear looked up at her cub hanging from the gutter, then back at Finn approaching with the honey. She seemed to be wrestling with her instincts, her desire to protect her baby fighting with her growing understanding that these humans meant no harm. Ruby made a particularly melodic sound, and the mother bear actually took a small step to the side, as if she was making room for Finn to approach. Encouraged, Finn continued walking forward until he was close enough to set the honey jar on the ground, about 6 feet from where the mother bear stood. Then he backed away slowly, his hands raised to show he wasn't a threat. The mother bear approached the jar cautiously and sniffed it thoroughly. She looked back up at her cub, then at Finn, then at Ruby in the doorway. It was as if she was processing all of this information and trying to decide what to do. Ruby chose that moment to do something that surprised everyone again. She began crawling out of her mother's arms and onto the porch floor. Before Sage could stop her, the baby had managed to crawl several feet toward where Finn was standing. "Ruby, no!" Sage called out, but her daughter was determined. The mother bear watched this small human baby crawling across the porch with obvious curiosity. Ruby stopped when she was about halfway between her parents and where Finn stood, and she sat up and began babbling directly to the mother bear. It was an incredible sight. A 9-month-old human baby having what appeared to be a conversation with a full-grown black bear, while a bear cub hung desperately from a gutter overhead, and meteors continued to streak across the sky above them all. The mother bear took a step closer to Ruby, her massive head tilted as if she was trying to understand what the baby was saying. Ruby continued her babbling, occasionally pointing up at the cub, and then at the honey jar. Then the mother bear did something that left them all speechless. She gently picked up the honey jar in her mouth and walked over to where Ruby was sitting. Very carefully, she set the jar down right in front of the baby, as if she was giving it back to her. Ruby clapped her hands with delight and pointed up at the cub again. The mother bear followed her gaze, and then, as if she finally understood what needed to happen, she walked over to where the ladder was leaning against their house. With surprising gentleness for such a large animal, she pushed the ladder with her nose until it fell over. Then she began to drag it across the yard with her teeth, positioning it directly under where her cub was hanging. Finn stood frozen, watching this incredible display of intelligence and cooperation. The mother bear had understood that they needed the ladder to rescue her cub, and she was helping to position it herself. But there was still the question of who would climb the ladder. The mother bear was far too heavy, and while Finn could do it, he wasn't sure how the bear would react to him getting that close to her cub. Ruby seemed to have an answer for this too. She looked at the honey jar at her feet, then at her father, then up at the cub. She babbled something that sounded almost like words, and then she did something that made everyone understand her plan. She picked up the honey jar with both hands and held it up toward her father, as if she was saying, "Take this up to the cub." The mother bear watched this exchange and then looked at Finn with what could only be described as expectation. She was waiting for him to climb the ladder and rescue her baby. Ruby crawled closer to the mother bear, showing no fear at all. She reached out her tiny hand and actually patted the bear's massive paw, all while continuing to babble in her soothing, musical way. The bear looked down at this fearless human baby and made a soft rumbling sound that almost sounded like a purr. Then she looked back at Finn and, incredibly, stepped aside to give him clear access to the ladder. The message was clear. The mother bear was trusting this human to save her cub, all because a 9-month-old baby had somehow convinced her that they were there to help. But as Finn approached the ladder, the gutter gave an ominous creak, and they all realized that time was almost up. Whatever they were going to do, it had to happen now. The cub looked down at all of them with frightened eyes, its small paws still wrapped around the bending metal. One more meteor flashed overhead, illuminating the desperate scene below, and in that moment, everything seemed to hang in the balance. Ruby looked up at her father with complete trust and pointed at the ladder. The mother bear stepped back and sat down, as if she was giving him permission to proceed, and somewhere above them all, the cub whimpered softly, waiting to be saved by the most unlikely rescue team ever assembled. Finn's hands trembled as he gripped the sides of the ladder. He had climbed ladders hundreds of times before, but never with a mother bear watching his every move. Never with his baby daughter orchestrating the entire rescue, and never with a bear cub's life hanging in the balance. The first few rungs felt solid beneath his feet. The mother bear remained seated but alert, her dark eyes following his progress up the ladder. Ruby had crawled closer to the bear and was actually leaning against her massive foreleg, continuing her soft babbling as if providing commentary on the rescue attempt. When Finn was about halfway up the ladder, something unexpected happened. The cub, seeing him approaching, got excited and tried to reach toward him. The sudden movement caused the gutter to bend even more dramatically, and with a sharp crack, one of the brackets holding it to the house came completely loose. The cub dropped several inches and was now hanging by just one small section of gutter that was bending at an alarming angle. Its frightened cries echoed through the night, causing its mother to stand up abruptly and make anxious rumbling sounds. "Dad, hurry!" Sage called from the doorway, though she kept her voice as calm as possible to avoid startling the bears. Ruby seemed to sense the increased urgency. She looked up at the struggling cub, then at the worried mother bear, and then did something remarkable. She began to sing again, but this time her melody was different. More urgent but still soothing, as if she was trying to calm everyone at once. The mother bear responded by making soft huffing sounds back to Ruby, and incredibly the cub stopped struggling and seemed to listen to their exchange. It was as if Ruby was keeping everyone focused and calm during the crisis. Finn climbed faster, the honey jar tucked securely in his jacket pocket. When he reached the level of the hanging cub, he could see just how precarious its situation had become. The remaining gutter bracket was making ominous creaking sounds, and the metal was visibly bending under the cub's weight. "Hey there, little one," Finn said softly, extending his hand toward the frightened bear cub. "I'm here to help you." The cub looked at him with wide, scared eyes. It was so young that it probably had limited experience with humans, and here it was, hanging 20 feet off the ground, face to face with one. But then Ruby's voice carried up from below, her melodic babbling somehow managing to reach the cub even at this height. The little bear's ears perked up, and it seemed to remember that the sounds coming from this human family were safe sounds. Finn slowly reached into his pocket and pulled out the honey jar. The cub's nose twitched as it caught the sweet scent, and for the first time since he'd started climbing, it seemed to relax slightly. "That's right," Finn encouraged. "We brought this for you and your mama." Very carefully, he unscrewed the lid of the honey jar and let the cub smell the contents. The bear cub made a small, interested sound, and its grip on the gutter seemed to become less desperate and more hopeful. But then, disaster struck again. A particularly large meteor blazed across the sky, brighter than any that had come before. The sudden flash of light startled everyone, including the cub, which jerked in surprise. The movement was too much for the damaged gutter, and with a loud metallic screech, it gave way completely. The cub fell. But Finn was ready. In a moment of pure instinct and adrenaline, he dropped the honey jar and caught the falling bear cub in his arms. The jar shattered on the ground below, but he held the cub safely against his chest. The mother bear let out a roar that shook the entire forest. For a terrifying moment, Finn thought she was going to charge up the ladder after him. But Ruby's voice rose above the chaos, her babbling now urgent and explanatory, as if she was telling the mother bear that her cub was safe. The little bear in Finn's arms was trembling but unharmed. It looked up at him with those dark eyes and then did something that melted his heart. It made a small chirping sound and nuzzled against his chest, as if it understood that he had saved its life. But now came the challenge of getting back down the ladder while holding a bear cub. Finn had both arms wrapped around the small animal, which meant he couldn't hold on to the ladder properly. Ruby seemed to understand this problem too. She crawled away from the mother bear and positioned herself at the bottom of the ladder, then looked up at her father and made encouraging sounds. The mother bear, seeing her cub safe in Finn's arms and hearing Ruby's continued soothing babble, seemed to make a decision. She walked over to the ladder and placed her massive paws on either side of it, as if she was stabilizing it for Finn's descent. It was an incredible sight. A wild bear helping to ensure the safe return of her cub. Finn began his careful descent, the cub still clinging to his chest. Every few steps he would pause to adjust his grip, and each time the mother bear would look up at him anxiously but remain in position. Ruby continued her musical babbling throughout the entire descent, and the cub in Finn's arms actually seemed to be responding, making soft sounds back to her as if they were having a conversation. When Finn was just a few feet from the ground, the cub began to squirm with excitement. It could smell its mother and hear her anxious breathing. But instead of jumping down immediately, it looked back up at Finn and made a sound that almost seemed like gratitude. Finn stepped off the ladder and very gently set the cub down on the ground. The little bear immediately ran to its mother, who enveloped it in her massive paws and began licking its fur frantically, checking for injuries. Ruby clapped her hands with delight and made joyful babbling sounds. She crawled toward the reunited bear family, showing no fear, even though the adult bear was easily 50 times her size. But what happened next surprised everyone. The mother bear, after thoroughly examining her cub and satisfying herself that it was unharmed, turned toward the human family. She approached Finn slowly, her cub following closely behind her. For a moment, Finn thought she might be angry about his handling of her baby, but instead, the massive bear did something extraordinary. She gently touched her nose to his hand in what could only be interpreted as a gesture of gratitude. The cub, emboldened by its mother's actions, toddled over to where Ruby was sitting and actually touched noses with the baby. Ruby giggled with pure delight and reached out to pet the cub's soft fur. Sage watched this incredible scene from the doorway, tears streaming down her face. Her 9-month-old daughter had somehow orchestrated the rescue of a bear cub and created a moment of connection between two completely different species. But the night surprises weren't over yet. As the meteor shower began to intensify overhead, something amazing happened. Both the cub and Ruby looked up at the sky at the same time, and they began making sounds together, Ruby with her musical babbling, and the cub with soft chirps, as if they were singing to the meteors above. The mother bear sat down and watched this display with what could only be described as contentment. She occasionally made soft rumbling sounds that seemed to harmonize with the baby's song. Finn and Sage found themselves sitting on their porch, watching their daughter duet with a bear cub under a meteor shower while the mother bear provided backup vocals. It was perhaps the most surreal and beautiful moment either of them had ever experienced. The strangest part was how natural it all felt. Ruby showed no surprise at any of what had happened, as if she had always known that humans and bears could be friends, as if this kind of cross-species cooperation was the most normal thing in the world. As the meteor shower reached its peak, with dozens of shooting stars streaking across the sky every minute, the two babies continued their celestial concert. The mother bear eventually lay down on her side, creating a natural windbreak for both babies, who continued to babble and chirp together. But as beautiful as this moment was, Finn and Sage knew it couldn't last forever. The bears were wild animals, and they needed to return to their natural habitat. Yet neither parent had the heart to break up this magical connection their daughter had formed. Ruby seemed to sense this dilemma. She looked at the cub, then at its mother, then back at her own parents. Her expression became thoughtful, as if she was processing something important. Then she crawled over to where the broken honey jar lay scattered on the ground. Very carefully, avoiding the glass shards, she picked up a piece of honeycomb that had fallen out when the jar broke. She held this up to show the mother bear, then pointed toward the forest. The bear tilted her head, as if trying to understand what the baby was telling her. Ruby repeated the gesture, pointing from the honeycomb to the trees, and made soft babbling sounds that had a different quality to them, almost like she was saying goodbye. The mother bear seemed to understand. She stood up and nuzzled her cub gently, encouraging it to say its farewells. The cub approached Ruby one more time and touched its nose to her tiny hand. Ruby giggled and patted its fuzzy head, then pointed toward its mother and made encouraging sounds. It was as if this wise little baby understood that families belong together in their natural homes, and that sometimes even the most magical friendships had to end. The mother bear looked at Finn and Sage one more time, as if memorizing their faces. Then she made a soft rumbling sound that somehow conveyed gratitude, goodbye, and promise all at once. The two bears began walking toward the forest, but they paused at the edge of the tree line. The cub looked back and made one final chirping sound toward Ruby, who responded with her own musical babble. And then they were gone, disappearing into the darkness between the trees like shadows melting into shadows. Ruby sat on the porch, looking toward where they had vanished, and made soft sounds that seemed almost wistful. But she wasn't sad. There was something in her expression that suggested she knew this wasn't really goodbye, but rather the beginning of something larger. The meteor shower was beginning to fade, but the night sky remained magical, filled with the memory of what had just occurred. A baby human and a baby bear had formed an impossible friendship. Two species had worked together to save a life, and a family had witnessed something that would change their understanding of the world forever. As Finn carried Ruby back inside, she looked over his shoulder toward the forest and made one final soft sound. From somewhere in the darkness, too distant to see but close enough to hear, came an answering chirp. The connection between the two babies had been brief, but it had been real. And somehow, everyone involved understood that this was just the beginning of a much larger story. Over the next several days, life in the cabin returned to what Sage and Finn thought would be normal. But Ruby had changed. She spent most of her time by the windows, making soft sounds toward the forest. Her parents noticed that her babbling had taken on new patterns, almost like she was practicing different types of conversations. The shattered honey jar had been cleaned up, but Finn found himself stopping at the grocery store to buy more honey. He couldn't explain why, but it felt important to have it in the house. Sage caught him one evening, standing on the porch with a new jar in his hands, looking toward the trees as if expecting visitors. "You feel it too, don't you?" she asked softly, joining him outside. Finn nodded. "It's like something's changed. Not just with Ruby, but with this whole place, like the forest is paying attention to us now." They were both right. What they didn't know was that the mother bear and her cub hadn't gone far. They had made a new den less than a mile away, close enough to keep an eye on the human family that had saved their lives. The bears had their own way of telling the story to other forest creatures. The raccoons were the first to hear about the human baby who could talk to bears. Then the deer learned about the family that shared honey with strangers. Word spread through the forest in the way that animal news traveled, through scent marks, calls, and chance meetings. Ruby seemed to sense this growing attention. She would often point toward different areas of the forest and babble excitedly, as if she could see or hear things her parents couldn't. One week after the meteor shower, something extraordinary happened. Ruby was having her afternoon nap when she suddenly woke up and began crying softly. Not the usual cries of hunger or discomfort, but a specific sound that Sage had learned meant Ruby wanted to go outside. "It's too early for your walk, sweetie," Sage said gently, but Ruby was insistent. She pointed toward the door and made the same melodic sound she had used with the bear cub. Sage found herself picking up the baby and walking toward the window. As soon as Ruby could see outside, she stopped crying and began making excited babbling sounds. There, at the edge of their yard, stood the mother bear and her cub. They weren't approaching the house, just standing there as if they were waiting for something. The cub kept looking toward the cabin and making soft chirping sounds. Ruby pressed her tiny hands against the window glass and responded with her own babbling. It was like watching two old friends having a conversation across a distance. "Finn," Sage called, her voice filled with wonder. "Come quickly!" Finn rushed from the kitchen and stood amazed as he watched the reunion. The bears had come back, but they seemed different somehow. More relaxed, more purposeful. Ruby pointed toward the door and looked at her parents with questioning eyes. She wanted to go outside to see her friend. "I don't know," Finn said hesitantly. "What if other people see? What if someone thinks the bears are dangerous and calls animal control?" As if understanding his concerns, the mother bear did something remarkable. She led her cub back several steps, creating more distance between them and the house. Then she sat down and remained perfectly still, as if demonstrating that she posed no threat. Ruby continued to babble toward the bears, and the cub responded with excited chirps. Whatever they were saying to each other, it seemed important. Finally, Sage made a decision. "Just for a few minutes," she said. "But we stay on the porch." They stepped outside, Ruby cradled in her mother's arms. The baby immediately began making joyful sounds, and the bear cub responded by standing up on its hind legs and waving its front paws. It was then that Finn noticed something that made his breath catch. The cub had something in its mouth. As they watched, it carefully set the object down and pushed it forward with its nose. "What is that?" Sage whispered. The mother bear encouraged her cub with gentle nudges, and the little bear picked up the object again and took a few steps closer to the porch. When it was close enough for them to see clearly, they realized what the cub was carrying. A piece of honeycomb, perfectly intact and glistening with golden honey. The cub set it down on the grass and backed away, looking between Ruby and the honeycomb expectantly. "It's a gift," Sage said with amazement. "The cub is giving Ruby a gift." Ruby clapped her hands and made delighted, babbling sounds. She struggled in her mother's arms, clearly wanting to go to her friend. Very carefully, Sage carried Ruby down the porch steps and closer to where the honeycomb lay. The mother bear watched this approach but remained calm, as if she had expected this response. When they were close enough, Ruby reached out toward the honeycomb, but instead of trying to take it, she pointed back toward the bears and made soft sounds that seemed to convey gratitude. The cub chirped excitedly and ran back to its mother, who nuzzled it proudly. It was clear that the gift-giving had been the cub's idea, and its mother was pleased with its thoughtfulness. But the surprises weren't over. As Sage was about to carry Ruby back to the house, they heard sounds coming from the forest. Not alarming sounds, but a variety of different animal calls that seemed to be getting closer. Within minutes, other forest animals began appearing at the edge of the clearing. First came a family of raccoons, their masked faces curious and alert. Then a pair of deer stepped delicately out of the tree line. Even a few squirrels chattered from nearby branches, as if they too had come to see the remarkable human baby. Ruby was beside herself with excitement. She pointed at each new arrival and made different sounds for each species. Soft coos for the deer, chattering sounds for the squirrels, and playful babbles for the raccoons. "I can't believe this," Finn said quietly. "It's like she's holding court with the entire forest." The mother bear seemed to be orchestrating this gathering. She made soft rumbling sounds to each group of animals as they arrived, as if she was introducing them to Ruby and explaining why they were all there. The most incredible part was that all these different species, who would normally avoid each other or compete for territory, were gathering peacefully in the same space. The bear's presence seemed to guarantee safe passage for everyone. Ruby continued her various animal conversations, and remarkably, each species seemed to respond in their own way. The deer stepped closer and lowered their heads in what looked like a greeting. The raccoons chattered back to her babbling. Even the usually skittish squirrels came down from their trees to get a better look. As the sun began to set, painting the forest in golden hues, the gathering took on an almost ceremonial quality. Ruby was placed gently on a blanket on the grass, and the animals formed a loose circle around her. The bear cub, emboldened by the peaceful atmosphere, toddled over to Ruby and sat down beside her. Ruby immediately began patting its fuzzy head and babbling in her special bear talk. What happened next would be talked about in the forest for generations to come. Ruby began to sing. Not her usual baby babbling, but something more structured, more melodic. It was a simple tune, but it had the quality of a lullaby or a blessing. One by one, the other animals began to join in with their own voices. The deer made soft lowing sounds, the raccoons added their chittering, the squirrels contributed their chattering, and the bears provided deep, rumbling harmonies. It was as if the entire forest was singing together, with a human baby as their conductor. Sage and Finn stood on their porch, tears streaming down their faces as they witnessed this impossible concert. Their daughter had somehow become a bridge between their world and the wild world, creating connections that shouldn't have been possible. As the song came to a natural end, the animals began to disperse slowly. Each group stopped near Ruby before leaving, as if saying goodbye. The deer touched her gently with their noses. The raccoons chittered softly to her. The squirrels dropped small acorns near her blanket as gifts. Finally, only the bear family remained. The mother bear approached Ruby one more time and made a sound that was different from any they had heard before. It was complex, almost like a sentence in bear language. Ruby listened intently, her baby face serious and focused. When the bear finished, Ruby responded with an equally complex babble that seemed to mirror the bear's patterns. The cub then said its own goodbye, touching noses with Ruby one last time before following its mother back into the forest. As darkness fell and the first stars appeared overhead, Sage carried Ruby back into the house. But the baby kept looking back toward the forest, making soft sounds as if she was singing to the trees themselves. That night, as her parents tucked her into her crib, Ruby didn't cry or fuss as she sometimes did at bedtime. Instead, she lay quietly, making soft musical sounds that seemed to blend with the night sounds coming from the forest outside. "What do you think just happened out there?" Sage whispered to Finn as they watched their daughter drift off to sleep. "I think," Finn said slowly, "our daughter just became the first human ambassador to the animal kingdom." As if in response to his words, a distant howl echoed from the forest. Not threatening or wild, but almost like an acknowledgement. Like the forest itself was saying goodnight to the little human who had somehow learned to speak their language. Ruby smiled in her sleep, and for the first time since the meteor shower, her parents felt like their world had found a new kind of peace. But they also sensed that this was just the beginning of Ruby's extraordinary relationship with the creatures of the forest. In the days that followed, they would discover just how right they were. The animals had accepted Ruby as one of their own, and that acceptance would bring both wonders and challenges that none of them could have imagined. The forest had claimed their daughter as a friend, and there was no going back to the way things were before. 3 months later, Sage stood at the kitchen window, watching Ruby play in their backyard. The 9-month-old had learned to crawl faster than any baby they knew, but she rarely used this skill to explore the house. Instead, she would crawl to the edge of their porch and sit there, making her musical sounds toward the forest. Today was different, though. Today was special. It was Ruby's first birthday, and the forest seemed to know it. Throughout the morning, animals had been gathering at the tree line. Not just the bear family they had come to know, but deer, raccoons, squirrels, a family of foxes, and even a magnificent owl that normally only appeared at night. "Finn," Sage called softly, "you need to see this." Finn joined her at the window and gasped. Their yard was surrounded by a peaceful assembly of woodland creatures, all sitting quietly as if waiting for something. Ruby noticed them too. She clapped her hands with delight and began making the complex babbling sounds that had become her way of talking to her forest friends. The bear cub, now considerably larger than when they had first met, bounded forward and sat directly in front of the porch. It had something in its mouth, a small bundle wrapped in what looked like large leaves. "Another gift," Finn said with wonder in his voice. But this time, the cub wasn't the only one bearing presents. As if following its lead, other animals began approaching, each carrying something special. The deer family brought wildflowers, somehow managing to keep them intact in their gentle mouths. The raccoons had gathered shiny stones and smooth pieces of glass polished by the stream. The squirrels presented an impressive collection of the most perfect acorns and pine cones they had ever seen. Even the foxes, typically the most cautious of all the forest dwellers, approached with gifts, beautiful feathers they had collected from their woodland travels. Sage looked at Finn, tears already forming in her eyes. "They're throwing her a birthday party. The entire forest is celebrating our daughter's birthday." Ruby seemed to understand the significance of the moment. She stood up carefully, still wobbly on her little legs, and took her first real steps, not toward her parents, but toward her animal friends. Finn and Sage held their breath as their 1-year-old daughter walked unsteadily across the yard toward the gathered animals. Each step seemed to bring a hush over the forest, as if every creature was holding its breath too. When Ruby reached the bear cub, she sat down carefully and unwrapped the leafy bundle it had brought. Inside was the most beautiful piece of crystallized tree sap they had ever seen, nature's own amber, glowing like captured sunlight. Ruby held it up to the light and giggled as it cast golden sparkles across her face. She looked at the bear cub and said something that sounded remarkably like "thank you" in her special animal language. What happened next would remain one of the most beautiful memories of their lives. One by one, each animal approached Ruby to present their gift, and with each presentation, Ruby seemed to have a specific response, different sounds, different gestures, as if she knew exactly what each gift meant and how to properly acknowledge it. The mother bear, who had been watching from a respectful distance, finally approached. In her massive jaws, she carried something that made both parents gasp. It was a small piece of meteor rock, smooth and dark, obviously from the shower that had brought them all together that magical night months ago. The bear gently placed it in front of Ruby, who picked it up with both hands and held it close to her heart. She looked up at the enormous bear and made a sound that was pure love and gratitude. The mother bear responded by very gently nuzzling Ruby's head with her massive snout. It was a gesture so tender and careful that it took Sage's breath away. Then, as the sun reached its highest point in the sky, something extraordinary began to happen. Ruby stood up and began to sing. Not baby babbling this time, but actual melody, her first real song. It was simple and sweet, with a rhythm that seemed to match the heartbeat of the forest itself. As she sang, the animals began to join in again, each adding their own voice to create a symphony that was unlike anything that had ever been heard. The song went on for several minutes, with Ruby conducting her forest orchestra with gestures and sounds that seemed to come from some deep, instinctive place within her. When the song finally ended, the forest fell completely silent for a moment, as if the whole world was holding its breath. Then, slowly, the animals began to disperse. But instead of simply leaving, each one stopped to touch Ruby gently. A nose to her hand, a wing brushing her cheek, a paw touching her shoulder. The bear cub was the last to say goodbye. It sat with Ruby for a long time, and the two babies seemed to have an entire conversation in their special language. When it was time to leave, the cub touched noses with Ruby one more time and made a sound that clearly meant until next time. As the animal families returned to the forest, Ruby gathered all her birthday gifts and carefully placed them in a pile on the porch. She looked at each one with the serious appreciation of someone much older than her single year. Sage and Finn sat on either side of their daughter, marveling at what they had just witnessed. "She's going to be different, isn't she?" Sage said softly. "She already is," Finn replied, watching Ruby arrange her gifts with careful precision. "But maybe that's exactly what the world needs." Ruby looked up at her parents and for the first time said a clear human word, "home." She pointed to the house behind them, then to the forest in front of them, and repeated home. Sage and Finn understood. For Ruby, home wasn't just their cabin or just the forest. Home was this magical place where two worlds met, where humans and animals could be friends, where a baby's song could unite creatures that had never known they could live in harmony. As the evening approached and the first stars began to appear, Ruby fell asleep in her father's arms, still clutching the piece of meteor rock the mother bear had given her. That night, the sounds from the forest were different. They were softer, more peaceful, as if all the woodland creatures were sleeping better, knowing that their human friend was safe and happy in her home at the edge of their world. Over the months and years that would follow, Ruby would continue to grow into her role as bridge between the two worlds. She would learn to speak both human language and the languages of the forest with equal fluency. She would become a protector of the woodland and its creatures, and they would become protectors of her. The night of the meteor shower had changed everything. A baby's compassion had saved a bear cub's life, but in return, the forest had given her a gift far greater than any meteor could bring from the heavens. They had given her a second family, a magical kinship with the natural world that would shape who she became and how she saw the universe around her. And sometimes, on clear nights when meteors danced across the sky, if you listened very carefully, you could hear singing coming from the edge of Pine Valley, a lullaby shared between species, a song of friendship that bridged worlds, sung by a little girl and her forest family under the starlight. The bear cub had been stuck on a roof during a meteor shower. What a baby did was indeed shocking. She had brought two worlds together with the pure power of love and created a harmony that would echo through the forest for generations to come. Some connections transcend species, transcend logic, transcend everything we think we know about the boundaries between the human world and the wild world. And sometimes, just sometimes, those connections start with a baby who refuses to see those boundaries at all.